In this video, we're going to look at the different strands of nationalism, and overall, in terms of the different strands of nationalism or nationalism itself, nationalism has been described as Janus-faced, and the Roman god often just looked as two-faced. But it's Janus-faced in the sense that nationalism and the strands can variously be described as progressive, peaceful, rational, democratic, inclusive, and a belief in equal nations. And equally, nationalism can also be seen, depending on the strand, as reactionary, warlike, violent, mystical, authoritarian, exclusive, and a hierarchy of nations. So this idea of nationalism being Janus-faced crops up again and again when comparing the strands, but also within the strands themselves, they can be Janus-faced themselves. Another expression you can use in your essays, particularly in the introductions, before you start comparing the strands, is also been described as a cross-cutting, a bit like feminism ideology. It cuts across a number of ideologies, or it's a chameleon ideology. It's compatible with other more traditional ideologies such as liberalism, conservatism, socialism, and fascism. So the different strands within nationalism are liberal, conservative, expansionist or chauvinist, and anti-colonial and post-colonial. Liberal nationalism draws heavily on the ideology of liberalism, and if you grasp liberalism from Unit 3, it's easy enough to apply it to liberal nationalism in this unit. Liberalism focus on the individual, and for liberals, the individuals all are of equal moral worth. We individuals are rational, and we have a right to freedom to pursue our own path. We have a right to autonomy, which you can call individual sovereignty. We have a right to toleration from others and towards others. We're rational, we will respect the rule of law, and a society composed of individuals will contribute to a natural balance and harmony. Liberal nationalists, in essence, take the same principles and apply them to nations. For liberal nationalists, all nations are of equal moral worth. Nations will act rationally. Nations have a right to self-determination, same as individuals. Nations will be tolerant towards each other. Nations will respect the rule of law. And in a world of nation states, there will also be a natural harmony and balance. So liberal nationalism applies the same criteria, the same beliefs it has for individuals towards nations. Noted liberal nationalists would include Bolivar, who led revolutions against Spanish rule in South America, Mazzini, who led the struggle for Italian unification, and of particular importance would be Wilson, whose 14 points after World War I formed the basis of reconstruction of Europe, and we mentioned him in the core themes. Again, briefly revisiting the map of Europe prior to the First World War, pretty much dominated by multinational, dynastic, autocratic empires, which liberal nationalists, particularly Wilson, saw as one of the main causes of World War I, that these multinational empires were essentially unstable and they were militaristic, and competition between them led to the First World War, or certainly contributed to it. And therefore, when the First World War ended, there's this attempt to redraw the boundaries within Europe to create a Europe of independent nation states. And again, according to liberal nationalists, these independent nation states would be rational, tolerant, and so forth, and would lead to peace, the nation state being superior to these multinational, multi-ethnic, unstable, dynastic empires. So liberal nationalists, such as Wilson, believed that a world of independent, democratic nation states would result in peace and international harmony. So liberal nationalism can be characterized as it's peaceful, it's progressive, and it's rational, it's forward-looking. Similar to liberals themselves, who fear a state of nature and believe in a minimal government, because although they're generally positive about individuals, they do believe that individuals can be self-interested and self-seeking. Therefore, in a world of independent nation states, you may have an international state of nature, and some states may be tempted to exploit other states for their own self-interest. So therefore, liberal internationalists advocate free trade between countries to foster good relations and interdependence, and they also support the existence of supranational organizations such as the League of Nations and the UN to maintain international order and ensure peace and stability. So that in essence is liberal nationalism. Criticisms of liberal nationalism is naivety. Liberals are too nice. They neglect the darker, irrational and tribal features associated with nationalism. Not all nationalists will always be rational constitutionalists. Leading on to that, they neglect the emotional side of nationalism, the willingness to die for one's country. Nations do not always respect the right to self-determination and sovereignty of other nations, as we'll see. And this idealization of nation states is also naive in the sense that nation states are rarely, if ever, entirely homogeneous and are prone to internal divisions, linguistic, religious, ethnic, and so forth. The next strand is that of conservative nationalism. And if liberal nationalism falls under the umbrella of a political or civic nationalism, cultural nationalism falls under the umbrella of ethno-cultural nationalism, which we looked at in the core themes. Conservative nationalism tends to develop in established nation states, and it's primarily concerned not with civic values or political values, but with social cohesion and public order, embodied in this idea of national patriotism. It views the nation in historical terms, and thus tends to be exclusive, a cultural-based form of nationalism, and then it occasionally tips over into racialist forms of nationalism. National patriotism gives individuals a sense of social rootedness and helps strengthen social cohesion. From those points, we can see that just as liberal nationalism draws on some core themes of liberalism from Unit 3, so conservative nationalism draws on some of the core themes of conservatism from Unit 3. Conservatism believes in the organic nation, in the idea of human imperfection, as particularly psychological imperfection, and the need to stick to the familiar, the known, and the tried. The conservative emphasis on order and social cohesion, the conservative emphasis on patriotism, and the respect for tradition, order, authority, hierarchy, and stability. So conservative nationalism draws on those themes, sees the nation, like society, is organic. It has emerged naturally out of the desire of people to live with others like themselves. Again, drawing on this idea of human imperfection. We seek and find security in a national community. For conservatives, nationalism promises social cohesion and public order. It counteracts divisive socialist doctrine of class politics, a defense of tradition. In essence, nationalism is an antidote to socialism or possible social disorder. Emerges roughly the same time as one nation conservatism. Again, it can be seen as a form of elite manipulation. So conservative nationalism, if liberal nationalism can be described as progressive, rational, forward-looking, conservative nationalism is reactionary. It tends to look back to past glories. It's nostalgic. It can also be described as static in some sense. It doesn't really want to move forward, but it does look backwards, reactionary, and it's static. It's there to conserve. Conservative nationalism is anti-multiculturalism. It's monocultural. It believes in a single culture that produces stability, and it's anti-supranationalism. For example, if you think of the UKIP opposition to the EU. It's generally peaceful. Doesn't necessarily seek to expand its borders, except in particularly the late Victorian colonial and imperialist phases. Criticisms of conservative nationalism. The left-wing critique is that it's constructivist, again the word we came across in the core themes to do with organic nation, that nationalism is simply an elite form of manipulation, and Hobsbawm in particular. Nationalism is merely a series of invented traditions, and nationalism, the nation, merely deflects people from their true class interest. A more broader critique is that it's exclusive, unlike liberal nationalism, which is inclusive. Conservative nationalism is exclusive. It tends to promote intolerance, xenophobia and irrational hatred of others, bigotry and racialism, and will also seek enemies or others, in other words, to promote unity. It can overlap this ethno-cultural conservative nationalism with racialism and frequently tip into it. And it's reactionary, if you want to take reactionary as being a criticism, rather than progressive. It looks backwards to past glories rather than forward-looking. Third form of nationalism, which in a way is an extreme offshoot of conservative nationalism in a way, is expansionist or chauvinist nationalism. And again, this is based on the idea that some nations are superior to others, in complete contrast to liberal nationalism, which is nations are of equal moral worth. Expansionist or chauvinist nationalism argue that some nations are superior and some cultures are superior and should therefore be dominant. And this tends to be primarily achieved through military conquest. The world, it's a bit like an international state of nature, and it also an international survival of the fittest. Expansionist or chauvinist nationalism is underpinned by racialism, the belief in the genetic superiority of some races and some cultures over others. For example, the British and French empires in colonial times, and most obviously in Nazi Germany. Expansionist chauvinism can also be described as reactionary, looking to recapture past glories. For example, Italian fascism under Mussolini, trying to recapture the past glories of the Roman Empire. Hitler trying to create another 1,000-year Reich. But again, this Janus-based idea, it can also be described as progressive in a very perverse sort of way, in that Mussolini and Hitler and some expansionist nationalists and colonialists believed they were spreading civilization and a superior culture across the world. Something you could mention, but it's clearly mostly seen as reactionary expansionist nationalism. Features associated with expansionist chauvinist nationalism: it's militaristic, it's obviously self-explanatory expansionist, very exclusive. Rather than equal nations, there's a hierarchy of nations. Like conservative nationalism, it's based on emotions and instinct. It's not rational like liberal. It's certainly racialist, and it engenders unconditional obligations to the nation, not the civic values of liberal nationalism. And again, it's a form of ethno-cultural elitism. Particular names to use in expansionist nationalism: Maurras, the French ultra-conservative, became a collaborator during the Second World War. He advocated an intense nationalism where individuals and independent groups lose their identity within an all-powerful nation, called integral nationalism. And Chauvin himself, the French soldier, where the name comes from, chauvinism, who argued that nations are not equal in their right to self-determination, with some possessing qualities that make them superior to others. A first phase, if you like, of modern phase of expansionist chauvinist nationalism was in the colonial phase, the age of imperialism, and the phrase would be the scramble for Africa, when the colonial powers from Europe tried to take slices of Africa for themselves and exploit it in the belief, apart from the economic gains, that European culture that they came from was superior to the cultures that existed already in Africa. Then the second, much more aggressive, militaristic and arguably damaging phase of expansionist chauvinist nationalism was the emergence of Nazism and fascism, leading to the Second World War. Similar type of chauvinist or expansionist nationalism is also known as pan-nationalism, which is associated with a claimed national territory which does not correspond to existing political boundaries. For example, before the First World War, you had the pan-Slavism, particularly associated with Russia and Serbia, and Russia saw itself as the protector of all Slavs within Europe. And of course, it was Russia's guarantee to Serbia that allowed it to in a sense, take on or tweak the nose of Austria-Hungary, and Russia saw itself as attempting in some way to unite the dispersed Slav population in Europe. Before the Second World War, you had pan-Germanism. Hitler invaded the Sudetenland in Czechoslovakia, which was home to what were seen as 1 million ethnic Germans, which had been included in Czechoslovakia when it was the boundaries were drawn at the end of World War I, and also the Anschluss with Austria, which was seen as traditionally part of the German Empire. And still it goes on with currently Russia, pan-Russianism, if you want to call it, seeking to unite the people who regard themselves as ethnic Russians, certainly in the eastern Ukraine and the Crimea, which has already held a referendum and essentially sees itself as part of Greater Russia. So pan-nationalism can also be seen as expansionist and chauvinist. The final strand of nationalism is that of anti-colonial and post-colonial, and again we see this cross-cutting aspect to nationalism. Liberal nationalism draws on liberalism, conservative nationalism draws on conservatism, and anti-colonial nationalism draws heavily on the idea of socialism. And some of the core themes of socialism that we looked at in Unit 3, socialist analysis, Marxist analysis, is that of exploitation and oppression. For Marx, it was class exploitation, the bourgeoisie exploiting the proletariat. Socialism is also about class and group solidarity and the promotion of collectivism. So anti-colonial nationalism often was socialist in character. The quest for independence by the oppressed colonial countries was closely related to their awareness of their economic underdevelopment and subordination to the industrialized states of Europe and North America. They were deliberately kept underdeveloped and basically used as a resource base for the colonial powers. Marxism, socialism for the colonial leaders offered an intellectual analysis of colonialism and imperialism in terms of oppression and exploitation. Lenin in particular, who wrote a book, Imperialism, saw imperialism as capitalism expanding in search of cheap raw materials in new markets. The anti-colonial struggle could then be seen as similar to the class struggle, with the colonial powers in essence in the place of the bourgeoisie and the exploited nations in the place of the proletariat. So socialism for ambitious colonial leaders helped offer an analysis of their colonial experience under the colonial powers. Once they had achieved independence, socialism then also provided a template for building their new nation, because socialism provides a strong sense of community and collective identity. To try and redress these years of underdevelopment, socialist organization of the economy was also seen as the way of developing fast, rational economic modernization and growth, following the kind of Stalinist template of rapid industrialization and collectivization. Some of the newly freed countries also follow the Stalinist model in becoming sort of one nation authoritarian states as well. They buy into the kind of Stalinist model wholesale. Anti-colonial nationalism, similar to liberal nationalism, can be seen as progressive. It's about the quest for self-determination, from freeing one from an oppressive colonial power. It can also be, again, Jane, slightly reactionary in some cases, in that some of the newly independent countries would look to backwards to a previous culture that they try and recapture. Anti-colonial nationalism is not necessarily violent, but it can be in its early stages. You wouldn't say it's necessarily at all expansionist. And the slight offshoot of anti-colonial nationalism is post-colonial nationalism, which won't really be mentioned a great deal in your essays, but you can certainly mention it. But post-colonial nationalism, such as the Iranian Revolution, has often taken on an anti-Western voice and draws more on religious fundamentalism. It completely rejects Western ideologies and draws, again, on religious fundamentalism rather than any sense of Western ideologies. Examples of anti-colonial nationalists, Frantz Fanon advocated a breaking away from the colonial powers to the cathartic use of violence. Gandhi, of course, was a famous anti-colonial nationalist, the polar opposite. Non-violence was the weapon of the strong. And again, the Iranian Revolution, under the Ayatollah Khomeini, was an example of post-colonial nationalism, rejecting all Western ideologies and bringing religious fundamentalism to the fore. So, to look at and compare your 4 different strands of nationalism: liberal, political nationalism, peaceful, constitutional, rational, progressive, reformist, seeks after self-determination based on popular sovereignty. Conservative nationalism, emphasis on cultural, ethno-cultural nationalisms, traditional, organic, static. It's mystical rather than national, emphasis on cultural heritage, promotion of social stability and cohesion. It's reactionary, broadly backward-looking, and it was certainly chauvinistic and expansionist in the imperialist and colonial phases. Anti-colonial, anti-imperialist, anti-colonial, often revolutionary and socialist in character, can be seen as progressive and peaceful, but you can also mention occasionally it can be reactionary and violent in its early stages. Post-colonial nationalism is essentially anti-Western, rejects all Western ideologies based on religious fundamentalism. And then you have expansionist nationalism, emphasis again like extreme conservative nationalism, but it's deliberately expansionist, militaristic, aggressive, chauvinist, believes in a hierarchy of nations, hierarchy of cultures. It's mystical, emotional. Think of more as integral nationalism based on racialist doctrines, the supremacy of some races or nations over others. It's generally reactionary, but you can mention it can be progressive in a perverse sense, and they believe they were spreading superior culture to other nations.